Inside the U.S. Supreme Court, with the nation divided and cameras rolling, Jasmine Crockett defends her landmark bill, the Sensitive Locations Protection Act, designed to stop ICE from raiding schools, hospitals, and churches. But just as she prepares to argue for the lives behind the law, Justice Clarence Thomas blocks it cold, calling it political, dangerous, and emotionally driven. Minutes later, Crockett unleashes undeniable evidence. It burns through the silence, exposes the truth, and leaves Thomas with nowhere to hide. Gasps echo, cameras flash, and in seconds the most powerful judge in America begins to fall. What did Jasmine say? That brought a Supreme Court justice to his knees on live television. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the weight of an election year, America trembled, not from war, not from collapse, but from something quieter and more sinister: fear. In the early months of the campaign season, ICE raids no longer hid in the shadows. They marched boldly into schools, crept into hospital emergency rooms, and stood at the back doors of Sunday church services like phantoms in uniform. Families stopped attending services. Parents sent their children to school with GPS trackers. Pharmacies saw lines vanish overnight. The chaos wasn't accidental. It was engineered. And in the heart of this storm stood Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, sleeves rolled up, voice hoarse from countless hearings, holding aloft a bill the country wasn't sure it deserved: the Sensitive Locations Protection Act. It had teeth. It had backing. It had passed the House by a razor-thin margin after one of the most combative debates in a generation. But just as it reached the final threshold, the Supreme Court, it hit a wall in the form of Clarence Thomas. From the high bench, cloaked in the gravitas of black robes and decades of jurisprudence, Justice Thomas didn't just block the law, he torched it. In a rare public statement, he declared Crockett's proposal a camouflage for chaos, accusing it of undermining the rule of law in the name of moral theater. The statement spread like wildfire, picked up by every conservative pundit, sewn into campaign ads by anti-immigrant PACs. It wasn't just a critique, it was a declaration of war. For Crockett, it felt like more than politics. It was personal. This was the man who once wrote dissents on privacy and power, and now he was using his own to strip humanity from communities who already lived in the shadows. She didn't wait for another news cycle. She called her team into a closed-door strategy meeting. If they want a legal war, she said, then I'll be the storm. By the end of that week, she had filed a formal challenge, not against the ruling itself, but against the process by which it was made. In an unprecedented move, she invoked her constitutional role as a lawmaker to request a congressional oversight review into the justice's potential conflicts of interest, citing Thomas's past connections with anti-immigration lobbying groups. The news sent shockwaves through Washington. No sitting representative had openly challenged a Supreme Court justice since the McCarthy era. But Crockett wasn't backing down. They built this court like a fortress, she told MSNBC, but they forgot one thing: the people always find a way in. Across the country, the line between law and morality blurred once again. And America braced for a showdown no one thought possible. And so, as Washington froze under the weight of a nation divided, Jasmine Crockett stepped into a courtroom not just to defend a law, but to put the system itself on trial. Inside the towering marble walls of the Federal Appellate Hall, tension gripped the air like a fist. The chamber was packed, reporters shoulder to shoulder, cameras blinking red, millions watching live. At one table stood Jasmine Crockett, calm but unshakable, gripping a single binder of evidence. Across from her, seated as a rare public respondent, was Justice Clarence Thomas, his reputation a fortress, his expression carved in stone. This wasn't just about a bill. It was about power, fear, and who got to decide what counted as justice in America. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. A silence fell, thick as fog. Then Jasmine rose and spoke, not as a politician, but as a witness to pain. This law protects the innocent. Who exactly does striking it down protect? Just as Jasmine's words carved open the heart of the room, Justice Clarence Thomas rose, not to respond, but to reassert a centuries-old hierarchy and remind the chamber who still held the gavel of tradition. He stood with calculated weight, his black robe folding around him like the past itself. No teleprompter, no notes, only the practiced cadence of a man who knew the power of every pause. "This bill," he began, his voice firm but unhurried, "is not a shield for the vulnerable. It is a smokescreen for disorder, crafted not to protect, but to provoke." He let that accusation linger, eyes scanning the room like a judge addressing the condemned. Then turning ever so slightly toward Jasmine's table, he struck deeper. "You call them sensitive locations. I call them compromised zones." His tone was calm, but each word landed like iron. He argued that sanctuaries, churches, schools, hospitals, had been twisted into symbols, manipulated for emotional gain. "What happens," he asked, "when we allow the law to be bent wherever it meets human discomfort? We don't preserve justice, we dissolve it." He warned that criminal networks would learn quickly where they could not be touched, that drug traffickers and smugglers would exploit these carved-out zones, using the same moral language that lawmakers like Crockett now use to defend them. "This bill," he said, "is not about safety. It is about surrender. You are not protecting institutions, you are dismantling enforcement." The courtroom had grown painfully still. Even Crockett's team, hardened by years of confrontation, knew they were witnessing more than a speech. This was a doctrine. Thomas was not merely challenging the bill. He was questioning whether empathy itself had a place in American law. And the injustice, the cruelty, lay in the way he wrapped his argument in logic so cold, so clinical, that it almost sounded rational. Almost. Because what he didn't mention were the children paralyzed by fear at school drop-offs, the patients who skipped surgery rather than risk detention, the prayers cut short not by God, but by sirens. And yet, as the camera zoomed in, Thomas's expression remained unreadable, unbothered by human consequence. To him, order was supreme, and anything that softened its edge, even for justice, was a threat. But then, like a blade honed over decades of silence, Clarence Thomas turned, not just to rebut her argument, but to cut directly into the woman behind it. He faced Jasmine Crockett fully now, abandoning the veil of general critique. His words, cold and clinical, were sharpened not by volume but by precision. "This nation does not survive on sentiment," he said flatly. "It survives on discipline, on restraint, on law." Then slowly and without blinking, he delivered the line that made the room collectively inhale. "What Representative Crockett has done," he said, "is confuse compassion for clarity. She romanticizes the law, dresses it in human tragedy, and expects it to stand." His tone never rose, but the disdain behind it was unmistakable. "She mistakes public grief for constitutional grounding. Emotion does not equal justice. Personal pain is not policy." It was not a legal argument. It was a character indictment delivered on national television. He wasn't just accusing her of being wrong. He was accusing her of being naive, reckless, dangerously unfit for the weight of legal authorship. For Jasmine, the moment was searing, not because it was unexpected. She had long known the fight would turn personal, but because of how calculated it was. Thomas had turned her greatest strength, her emotional honesty, her defense of lived human struggle, into a liability. And he'd done it with the ease of someone who'd seen compassion weaponized and dismissed it long ago. Around the courtroom, murmurs stirred. Some nodded. Others flinched. Millions watching from home saw a woman who dared bring stories into law be labeled as soft, unstable, unserious. And yet she didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Because in that moment, the real question was no longer about the bill, but whether America still had room for lawmakers who led not just with logic, but with a heart that refused to look away from suffering. The courtroom still echoed faintly with Thomas's rebuke, but Jasmine Crockett didn't retreat into silence. She rose with the quiet strength of someone who had carried too many untold stories for too long. She stood slowly, not with fire, but with purpose, anchored in something older than politics, the plain, unshakable weight of the Constitution. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence shifted the room. With respect, she began, her tone steady, almost reverent. The law was never meant to be cold. She opened her binder, not to perform, but to ground her defense in precedent. She read directly from Plyler versus Doe, the 1982 ruling that declared even undocumented children could not be denied education. This court once recognized, she said, that denying children access to school because of their status was not just illegal, it was un-American. Then she moved to Zedvitas Village. Davis, a 2001 case limiting the government's ability to detain immigrants indefinitely. We decided that human dignity doesn't expire when someone crosses a border, she said. Have we changed our minds? She closed the binder softly, looked directly at Justice Thomas, and spoke without hesitation. You have the authority to interpret the law, sir. You do not have the authority to erase compassion from it. Her voice didn't waver. She wasn't pleading. She was reminding. This bill doesn't abolish borders. It protects the innocent. It says hospitals are for healing, not for handcuffs. That schools are for learning, not for fear. For a moment, there was nothing else. No cameras, no crowd, no court hierarchy. Just a woman insisting that the law still belonged to the people it was written to serve. And in that stillness, she reclaimed not only the argument, but the moral high ground her opponent had tried to strip away. The room had heard the Constitution. It had felt the weight of precedent. But Jasmine Crockett knew that in a country drowning in data and debate, sometimes the only way to make them see the truth was to make them feel it. She turned slightly, looked toward the screen now descending behind her, and said calmly, "This is not theory. This is not hypothetical. This is what you've chosen to ignore." The lights dimmed. The video began, grainy, handheld, unedited. A normal weekday morning at a public elementary school in El Paso. Children ran from minivans and yellow buses, laughing, oblivious. And then, chaos. A black SUV pulled up hard to the curb. Two plainclothes ICE officers jumped out, shouting a name. A man, thin, mid-30s, still holding his daughter's Paw Patrol lunchbox, raised his hands before they touched him. The child, no older than 7, screamed his name and clutched his arm, refusing to let go. "Poppy, Poppy, don't go!" she cried, her voice cracking into raw panic. One officer tried to kneel and coax her away, while the other tightened cuffs. Her backpack slipped off. Her body trembled. And the man, her father, kept looking down at her, not resisting, only whispering something over and over through trembling lips. "Cuídala, cuídala. Take care of her." The video ended mid-cry. The courtroom lights returned with a brutal suddenness, but the air stayed heavy, as if no one had remembered how to breathe. Crockett let the silence stretch, not for drama, but because it was honest. She looked toward the justices. Her voice when it came didn't rise, it didn't need to. That was not a criminal. That was a father. And that little girl didn't care about immigration status. She cared about the man who walked her to school every morning. She paused. You can call this law enforcement. I call it a rupture in our humanity. Her eyes turned directly to Thomas. If this is justice, then what is cruelty? The room remained still, and in that stillness, every person present understood. Jasmine hadn't brought emotion to the law. She had brought the law back to where it belonged, to the people it was supposed to protect. The room was still thick with the weight of the video, of a child's scream echoing through the courtroom walls, when Clarence Thomas rose again, not with empathy, but with evidence meant to bury it. He held up a manila folder, the seal of the Department of Justice visible to every camera lens in the room. There was no rush in his movement, no tremor in his voice. He spoke as if he had waited patiently for his moment, and now intended to seize it with precision. "Let us return," he began, "to the facts, not feelings." He opened the folder and slowly removed a printed memorandum, stamped "Confidential Internal Review." Holding it in both hands like a verdict, he read from its contents, outlining allegations that human trafficking rings had identified and deliberately exploited the protections granted under sensitive location policies, sheltering undocumented suspects in churches, staging rendezvous near school zones, using clinics as safe houses under the guise of seeking treatment. His tone was steady, devoid of emotional inflection. When you designate entire categories of public space as untouchable, you invite those who wish to do harm to use our compassion as camouflage, he said. The law cannot afford to confuse mercy with naivete. He paused and then turned sharply toward Crockett. What we are witnessing is not a legal argument, it is a theatrical one. Representative Crockett has chosen emotion as her primary evidence. But public tears, he said, gesturing toward the screen that had just shown the sobbing child, do not erase the duty to enforce law. His voice was louder now, echoing with an almost prosecutorial rhythm. We must ask ourselves, what happens when sympathy becomes policy? When grief replaces governance? What she calls protection, he continued, the law may rightly call obstruction. That was the moment it happened. From the right side of the courtroom, where several conservative members of Congress sat stiffly in their suits, one began to clap. Slow, deliberate, each strike of palm against palm sending an audible shockwave through the chamber. Then another joined, then another. In seconds, a ripple of applause broke out among those seated in silent agreement with Thomas's argument. It wasn't loud, but it was pointed, intentional. It was meant to signal a shift in power. The judge called for silence, gavel in hand, but the damage was done. A few spectators in the gallery leaned forward, whispering, emboldened. Reporters' fingers danced over their keyboards as headlines began to form in real time. And yet, amid that sudden swell of noise and validation, Jasmine Crockett remained still. Not out of defeat, but out of something far heavier, recognition. She had seen this tactic before, the cold invocation of worst-case scenarios to erase the lived reality of millions. She knew the playbook: isolate an abuse, amplify it, and use it to justify sweeping cruelty. What Thomas had done wasn't the dismantling of her argument, it was the deflection of it. He hadn't contested that ICE tore families apart. He hadn't denied that children feared going to school or that people skipped chemo out of panic. He had merely pointed to the shadows, to the exceptions, and asked the country to fear them more than its own reflection. It was a cruel but familiar truth. In America, empathy still had to prove itself worthy of law, and today it would have to do it against a wall of applause, a stack of memos, and a man who believed that feeling less somehow meant governing better. As the echo of conservative applause faded and Justice Thomas's papers settled back onto the desk before him, Jasmine Crockett did not sit. She did not adjust her notes. She reached instead for the one truth no courtroom thunder could drown, a truth he had written with his own hand. She opened her binder slowly and pulled from it a sealed envelope, slightly worn at the corners, its red stamp marked with the seal of the Judicial Conference of the United States. Her hands didn't shake as she held it up before the courtroom, before the cameras, before Clarence Thomas himself. This, she said quietly but with unmistakable weight, is an internal memorandum authored in April of 2019 and submitted to the Subcommittee on Constitutional Protections during immigration enforcement hearings. Her voice was not performative. It was the voice of someone who had waited long enough. It contains language, under your signature, Justice Thomas, supporting the idea that immigration enforcement should avoid disrupting religious worship in sacred spaces. She paused just long enough to make the silence around her tighten. That such enforcement, if too aggressive or too visible, would erode the public's perception of procedural neutrality and constitutional restraint. Her words came slowly, clearly, not as accusation, but as undeniable recollection. She turned slightly toward the gallery now, making no attempt to mask what this moment represented. In 2019, the argument was about a Lutheran church in Michigan. A German national, in violation of a visa, was taken into custody in the middle of Sunday service. And you, sir, now she faced him fully, you said that was a bridge too far. Her tone sharpened, but it was not anger. It was the sound of restrained clarity. You said then that the state must not, in its zeal to enforce the law, abandon the sanctity of American ideals. A beat passed. She looked down briefly, then back up. So I ask you now, with respect, what changed? The room had no answer. Is the law more fragile today than it was 4 years ago? Is the church less sacred? Or is it that the man at the altar today speaks Spanish, not German? There was no outrage in her tone, only precision, surgical and painful. Because if your interpretation of constitutional restraint is only triggered when the name on the immigration file is Wilhelm and not Jorge, then we are not debating law. We are debating power, and whose lives are allowed to be seen as deserving of dignity under it. For a long moment, no one moved. Even the hum of camera equipment seemed to vanish. Justice Thomas said nothing. The gavel remained untouched. And around Jasmine Crockett, this one voice standing against centuries of institutional gravity, there was no applause. Only stillness. Only reckoning. And in that stillness, the courtroom changed. Not because a law had shifted or because a judge had yielded, but because a line had been drawn in public, on the record, in a place that was never supposed to allow someone like her to speak so plainly. And as the weight of Jasmine's evidence settled over the room, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Because the next voice wasn't hers. It belonged to someone who didn't come to debate law, but to testify to what happens when law forgets to be human. Dr. Chinedu Ease took the witness stand with a quiet gravity that shifted the air before he even spoke. A Nigerian-American cardiac surgeon with 20 years in trauma and emergency medicine, he was not a politician, not an activist. But today he had come to tell a story no one else in that room could, one that had haunted him every day since it happened. On January 3rd of this year, he began, voice low but firm, I was preparing for emergency bypass surgery on a patient named Jose Ramon Ruiz. His gaze moved slowly from one face to the next, never blinking. Mr. Ruiz had suffered 2 minor heart attacks and was entering cardiac distress. We had him prepped and sedated. My team was scrubbed in. The operating room was ready. He paused for a moment, not for drama, but for breath. The courtroom had gone completely still. At 8:17 a.m., 2 ICE agents entered the hospital with a removal order. They told our staff they were taking Mr. Ruiz into federal custody immediately. He leaned slightly into the microphone. I told them he was unstable, that moving him could kill him, that we needed just 2 more hours. Another pause. They said, and I remember this exactly, we don't wait for illegals to feel better. A quiet ripple moved through the room. Even the court stenographer slowed, her fingers pausing momentarily on the keys. They unhooked him from the IV line, disconnected his oxygen. No medical escort, no doctor's clearance. Just 2 armed men pulling a half-conscious father of 2 off a gurney. Dr. Ease's voice cracked, just once. He died en route to the holding facility, in the back of a transport van, alone. He looked up then, not at Thomas, not at Jasmine, but straight into the camera lens, broadcasting to millions. That was not immigration policy. That was a death sentence without a trial. He turned back toward the bench, his voice steady once more. We are told to believe the law protects order. But what order is preserved when we let bureaucracy override a human pulse? When the state values a visa status over a beating heart? No one clapped. No one moved. Because there was nothing to say. No rebuttal prepared for a doctor holding his pain in both hands and refusing to let it be sanitized for legal debate. Justice Thomas stared forward, motionless, but the shift was visible. Not in his posture, but in the nation watching. The testimony spread like wildfire across networks and social media. Headlines didn't spin it, they quoted it. And for millions who had tuned in expecting politics, they had instead heard the story of a man who died because a government office saw him as a file, not a father. What changed in that room wasn't policy, it was perspective. And for the first time, Clarence Thomas's authority didn't look invincible. It looked exposed. The testimony of Dr. Ease had cracked open the courtroom like a fault line, exposing not just a death, but a truth too raw to dismiss. And Clarence Thomas, feeling the ground shift beneath him, did what men in power often do when cornered. He struck back. He leaned forward, both hands gripping the edges of the bench, no longer the distant figure cloaked in detached authority. His voice, when it came, was sharper than before. No longer measured, but clipped. Urgent, defensive. Let's make one thing clear, he said, staring not at the witness stand, but directly at Jasmine Crockett. This hearing has ceased to be a legal review. It has become an emotional performance. He gestured toward the space where Dr. Ease had sat moments before. What we just heard may be tragic, but it is not legal argument. It is sentiment dressed up as strategy. Then, lowering his tone into something intended to cut deeper, he said, I will not, cannot allow the law to be dictated by tears. That is not jurisprudence. That is theater. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, loud, jarring, and too sudden. But they did not land the way he expected. There was no wave of applause, no reassuring nods from allies. Just silence, and not the respectful kind. The crowd had shifted. Even those who had once leaned forward in support now sat back, brows furrowed. Something had changed. His refusal to acknowledge the reality of what had been shared, of a man dying in a transport van, pulled from a hospital bed, no longer felt principled. It felt callous, detached, cold. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even look at him. She let the silence deepen because she understood something Thomas had just revealed. He had stopped speaking to the country. He was now speaking only to himself, to the doctrine he had built around detachment. And the public, watching in real time, could feel it. The backlash was swift and visceral. News anchors paused their commentary, openly questioning whether Thomas had lost touch with the people the law was supposed to protect. Civil rights attorneys posted excerpts of his outburst with captions like, "This is what happens when power forgets compassion." Social media lit up with a single rising sentiment. If law can't feel, how can it protect? And in that courtroom, designed to be sterile, neutral, untouched by the outside world, a nurse in the gallery shifted forward in her seat, still in scrubs, her voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough for nearby reporters to hear. He just called a man's death theater? Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a folded patient chart against her chest. That man could have been one of mine. It was in that moment, not with a shout, not with a ruling, but with a nurse's whispered disbelief, that Clarence Thomas's armor began to fracture. Because the question was no longer whether his argument was legally sound. It was whether his silence in the face of suffering, his disdain for the human cost, could still be called justice. And for the first time in decades, the answer didn't belong to him. The room had already watched a Supreme Court justice grow visibly rattled. But what Jasmine Crockett revealed next didn't just shake his argument, it pierced the very foundation of his credibility. She walked back to the podium slowly, deliberately, as if carrying something fragile yet explosive. From her case file, she retrieved a thin, clearly labeled folder, its contents arranged not for theater, but for truth. "Before I continue, Your Honors," she began, her tone quiet but controlled, "I believe the integrity of this proceeding requires one more fact." She opened the folder, held it up for the record, and continued. "This is a set of publicly filed financial disclosures submitted by Justice Clarence Thomas and corresponding documents from the United States Policy Reform Council." Her eyes never left the bench. 2 months before the Supreme Court decision to block the Sensitive Locations Protection Act, Justice Thomas accepted travel, accommodations, and a $15,200 speaking honorarium fully funded by that organization. There was no gasp, but there was a shift, an almost imperceptible tightening of the courtroom's air. Jasmine turned the page. This same organization has spent the past 5 years lobbying against immigration reform, specifically against any policy that limits federal enforcement zones. They've described legislation like mine as, quote, emotionally driven softness masquerading as constitutional duty. She stepped forward, voice tightening. That same phrase, emotionally driven, was used by Justice Thomas on record in this hearing, not 20 minutes ago. The weight of the connection wasn't just in the dollars. It was in the language, in the undeniable echo. She let the evidence sit for a moment, like a stain spreading across marble. "I am not here to question Justice Thomas's history," she said, "but I am here to question the appearance of neutrality in a case that affects millions of lives. When the ruling language of a Supreme Court justice mirrors the lobbying position of a group who funded his expenses weeks earlier, that is not impartiality. That is convergence. That is proximity too close for comfort." Her voice stayed level, but her words cut through the room like slow-moving thunder. This hearing is not just about immigration. It is about integrity. It is about whether the highest court in the land is still a place where justice is decided, or whether it's rented by invitation only. Clarence Thomas didn't respond. He didn't interrupt. His hands remained folded in front of him, but they were tighter now, the knuckles pale beneath the skin. The cameras caught it. The press gallery caught it. And outside that chamber, so did the country. News outlets broke the story in real time. Judicial watchdog. Clear conflict must be investigated. NPR. Lobby ties emerge in immigration bloc. Washington Post. $15,000 honorarium questions justice's role in ongoing case. The public conversation shifted, almost violently. What had been a legal debate became something far more dangerous to those in power. A credibility crisis. And Jasmine? She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply closed the folder, returned to her seat, and let the silence do what it was meant to do. Reveal. Not everything needs to be shouted to be heard. Sometimes the loudest thing in the room is a simple question, spoken clearly enough to expose what someone else was trying so hard to hide. What had started as a clash of ideologies was now snowballing into something Clarence Thomas could no longer contain, a full-scale institutional reckoning. The courtroom was no longer his stronghold, it was a crucible. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't just surviving in it, she was transforming it. Justice Elena Mercer, usually reserved, leaned forward, her hands folded tightly on the bench. She stared directly at the sealed financial exhibits Jasmine had submitted, and her tone was sharp but controlled. "Justice Thomas," she said, "can you confirm the timeline of your engagement with the United States Policy Reform Council and whether that engagement was disclosed prior to deliberation on this case?" No one breathed. It wasn't just a procedural question. It was the kind that raised the specter of judicial misconduct. Before Thomas could answer, Justice Ruffick Morgan, known for his disciplined skepticism, spoke next. "And furthermore," he said, "was any recusal considered given the council's documented positions on the specific legislative matter before us?" It was rare for justices to directly challenge each other in open session. Rarer still when the challenge came not from ideology, but from ethics. Thomas didn't respond. He didn't have to. The pause had already done the damage. His jaw tightened, his fingers laced together, rigid, as if holding something back. He looked less like a man dispensing justice and more like someone fending off collapse. The very questions he had used to dominate the conversation about integrity, constitutionality, the rule of law, were now being mirrored back at him. And this time, they weren't rhetorical. They were personal. Outside the courthouse, the ripple effect became a storm. By that evening, more than 700 open letters and statements had been released from religious organizations, school boards, hospital coalitions, veteran medical centers, immigrant-led nonprofits, and even groups unaffiliated with immigration law. From the National Association of Pediatric Surgeons to the Interfaith Alliance of Central Texas, the message was overwhelmingly unified. The right to safety in sacred spaces is not political, it is moral, and it is overdue. CNN aired a split-screen broadcast. On one side, the courtroom footage of Thomas falling silent. On the other, a high school teacher from El Paso reading her letter aloud, voice trembling as she described students crying in hallways when ICE raided a nearby parking lot. The next morning, every major publication, from the Washington Post to the Des Moines Register, ran front-page editorials condemning the ethics breach. Politico labeled it the most significant crisis of judicial confidence since the Kavanaugh hearings. The Atlantic ran a long-form exposé tracing a decade-long pattern of Thomas's undisclosed affiliations with policy lobbying groups. But perhaps the most devastating headline came from USA Today in bold black type, "When Justice is Paid For, the Clarence Thomas Conflict That Changed Everything." Meanwhile, on social media, the ground swelled with grassroots support for Crockett. Thousands shared clips of her confronting Thomas, of her voice refusing to waver under pressure, of her speaking the line that now echoed across every corner of the internet. Justice does not change because the person at the gate is Mexican, not German. The hashtag #Justice for Sanctuaries exploded. Celebrities, veterans, nurses, pastors, and trauma survivors all began posting stories about the importance of protected spaces, places that should remain untouched by the cold hand of enforcement. But even more stunning was the demographic shift in public opinion. In a nationally televised segment, the Pew Research Center released polling data taken within 48 hours of the hearing. The numbers were not just decisive, they were overwhelming. 72% of Americans supported Crockett's Sensitive Locations Protection Act. 63% of registered Republicans agreed that ICE enforcement should not be permitted inside hospitals or schools. 87% of independents said they were deeply disturbed by the story of Jose Ramon Ruiz, the patient pulled from surgery and left to die in federal custody. 58% of Americans said they no longer believed Clarence Thomas could render impartial judgment on immigration cases. The cultural moment shifted like a tectonic plate. Thomas, who had once moved within the untouchable corridors of judicial tradition, now stood on unstable ground. He hadn't just been questioned, he had been placed under the same scrutiny he had so often wielded against others. Editorial cartoons showed him sitting on a bench made of dollar bills. Late-night hosts opened their monologues with comparisons between Crockett's clarity and Thomas's silence. Even members of the legal community, typically protective of the court's image, began speaking out. The American Bar Association released a carefully worded statement calling for renewed attention to judicial ethics. A retired federal judge from the Fifth Circuit penned a widely shared op-ed titled, "When Judges Forget the People They Serve." Inside Jasmine Crockett's office, the phones didn't stop ringing. From rural pastors in Iowa to trauma nurses in Baltimore, thousands called to offer support. Her staff, exhausted and overwhelmed, printed out every letter, every statement, and plastered them across the office walls. Jasmine read many of them herself, quietly late at night after the cameras were gone. One note stood out, handwritten on notebook paper by a 13-year-old in Brownsville, Texas. It read, "My dad is undocumented and has cancer. You made me feel like I matter. Thank you for saying what no one else would." That, more than the poll numbers, more than the headlines, was the clearest evidence yet. This wasn't just a legal fight anymore. It was personal, it was national, it was moral. And for the first time in a generation, the country had drawn a line, not between parties, not between ideologies, but between cruelty and conscience. And on the right side of that line stood Jasmine Crockett, alone at first, but no longer. The final ruling fell not with thunder, but with the kind of silence that signals a nation holding its breath. What followed was not just a legal decision, it was a turning point written in restraint, morality, and one woman's refusal to be ignored. The courtroom was full, but no one moved. Even the reporters, conditioned to chaos and chatter, sat frozen as the Chief Justice read each line of the majority opinion. The Sensitive Locations Protection Act would stand. Every provision remained intact. The court acknowledged that while border enforcement was essential to national interest, it could not come at the expense of constitutional rights and basic human dignity. It was the first time in decades that the Supreme Court had explicitly drawn a boundary, not along a physical border, but between fear and decency. Then came the secondary decision, nestled in the legal language like a quiet bomb. Immigration and Customs Enforcement may not conduct enforcement actions within designated sensitive locations, including hospitals, houses of worship, and educational institutions, without a signed, judge-issued warrant and compelling cause rooted in national security. No exceptions, no ambiguities, no room for discretionary raids based on agency protocol. As the justices began to rise, Clarence Thomas remained seated, still rigid. He had not authored the opinion. His name did not appear on the majority. The court he had once commanded with silence and stare had, today, spoken over him. Jasmine Crockett did not glance in his direction. She didn't need to. Her focus was already beyond the room. She stood slowly, feeling every second of the years it had taken to reach this moment. The attempts to paint her as too angry, too black, too emotional, too radical, none of it mattered now. Because what had just happened wasn't theory. It was law. It was the kind of law that saves people before they become hashtags, that holds space for dignity before it's reduced to data, that dares to declare, you don't have to be perfect to deserve protection. Reporters swarmed near the doors, waiting for her to emerge, their microphones armed with questions. But Jasmine didn't stop to speak. She walked out of the chamber with the quiet defiance of someone who had already said everything that needed to be said. Outside the courthouse, the crowd exploded into applause, not of celebration, but of collective relief. People wept openly, embracing strangers, clutching signs that read, "My hospital is not a hunting ground," and "Faith without fear." A pastor from Detroit dropped to his knees in prayer. A nurse from Albuquerque FaceTimed her undocumented patient from the courthouse steps to tell him he could come back for chemotherapy. The steps became a mosaic of humanity, Muslim leaders linking arms with Jewish rabbis, public school teachers standing beside immigration attorneys, trauma counselors hugging mothers who hadn't been able to take their children to school in weeks. It wasn't just victory, it was vindication. And across the country, the ruling rippled like a tectonic shock. Within 48 hours, every ICE field office received a federal directive with urgent compliance requirements. Warrantless detainments in schools were halted. Operation schedules were frozen. Pending raids on hospitals in Texas and Nevada were canceled entirely. Internal memos warned of severe disciplinary consequences for any officer who violated the new boundaries. Civil liberties attorneys began preparing training sessions to educate local clinics, churches, and schools on their new protections under the ruling. In places like Fresno, Des Moines, and Atlanta, families that had been hiding for months emerged from the shadows, not because they were safe forever, but because for the first time, the law had stopped chasing them where they needed to be human. In Washington, the reaction was seismic. The Speaker of the House issued a statement calling the ruling a restoration of constitutional integrity. Civil rights organizations launched digital campaigns thanking Crockett by name. In a rare bipartisan moment, even moderate Republicans praised the decision's restraint and clarity. Editorial pages that had once questioned her temperament now hailed her discipline. The New York Times ran the headline, "Congresswoman Crockett wins landmark case. A new era for compassionate enforcement." The Atlantic called it the most significant civil liberties ruling of the decade. But Jasmine herself avoided the spotlight. She returned to her office, quietly declined every interview, and asked her team to take the afternoon off. When her chief of staff asked why, she simply said, "Because we did what we came here to do. Now let's give people time to breathe." And yet, as the day unfolded, she could not fully escape what she had become. That evening, she received over 30,000 emails, some from voters, some from survivors, some from people she would never meet. One came from a retired federal judge in Massachusetts who wrote, "Today you reminded us that the law is not an island and that justice without humanity is simply control." Another came from a second-grade teacher in Arizona. "My students drew pictures of you today. One of them asked if you were the woman who made it safe to go back to church. I said yes." And there in her quiet office, Jasmine read them all. As night fell, candlelight vigils lit up across the country. In Chicago, they gathered outside a church that had once been raided mid-service. In Miami, they circled the hospital where a father had been detained minutes before surgery. In Los Angeles, the playground where ICE had once waited in parked cars was filled instead with families, music, and children playing freely for the first time in months. The ruling had not changed everything, but it had changed enough. Enough to make people believe, even cautiously, that maybe the law didn't always have to be cruel to be strong. And inside that shift, inside that strange, still, sacred space where hope re-enters after a long absence, stood the silhouette of a woman who had been told too many times to sit down. Jasmine Crockett had not simply won. She had changed the rules. She had forced a system built to exclude people like her, to listen, to reckon, to bend. Not by shouting louder, but by refusing to stop speaking at all. And the system, at least this once, had finally listened. But as the nation celebrated a long overdue shift in justice, a new tremor rippled through the highest court, one that carried not Crockett's voice, but the echo of accountability finally catching up to power. 3 days after the ruling that cemented Jasmine Crockett's landmark victory, an unmarked envelope arrived in the office of the clerk at the Supreme Court. It contained a single-page, unsigned press statement, plain white paper, no seal, no letterhead, but the name on the bottom carried the weight of thunder: Clarence Thomas. The statement, released to the public just hours later, ignited the country once again. In light of recent developments and in respect to the integrity of this court, I am recusing myself from all future immigration-related cases until further notice. No apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just one line of retreat cloaked in procedural language. But behind the formality, everyone knew exactly what it meant. The most powerful man on the bench had been forced to step down from an entire body of law. The pressure that drove him there wasn't just public opinion, it was a confluence of outrage, exposure, and a rare bipartisan consensus that judicial ethics had been violated. In the 72 hours following Crockett's revelation about Thomas's financial entanglements with anti-immigration lobbying groups, the Senate Judiciary Committee had launched an emergency ethics review. Two moderate senators, one Democrat, one Republican, held a joint press conference calling the situation a foundational threat to judicial neutrality. Headlines exploded. Thomas under fire. Did dark money influence the court? Protesters gathered outside the Supreme Court gates, not chanting slogans, but reading names. Names of those deported from hospitals. Names of children separated from parents in church parking lots. Names of people failed not by enforcement, but by the silence of the very court built to protect their rights. Behind closed doors, even fellow justices began to question the optics. Justice Mercer, long known for her loyalty to institutional tradition, quietly arranged a meeting with Thomas and the Chief Justice. Sources later revealed that she had warned him, in no uncertain terms, that the court will not weather another year of this under your shadow. Clarence Thomas had survived scrutiny before: ethics scandals, financial questions, dissents so cold they chilled progress for a generation. But this was different. This wasn't a theoretical divide. This was personal. This was public. And this time, the receipts were real. So when the recusal notice arrived, it landed like a controlled demolition, surgical, quiet, but unmistakably final. He had not been impeached. He had not been voted out. But in the court of public trust, Clarence Thomas had been rendered mute on one of the most urgent human rights issues of the generation. And it didn't go unnoticed. The Boston Globe called it the first institutional surrender of the modern Supreme Court. Reuters described it as a crack in the marble. Legal scholars began to discuss whether a recusal under pressure could set precedent for future conflicts, especially in cases where political ideology and private influence blurred beyond recognition. Jasmine Crockett's response came not in a press conference, but in a handwritten note she gave to her staff to post online. It read, "Recusal is not redemption, but it is, at the very least, acknowledgement. May it remind us that unchecked power only ends when someone dares to check it." The post received millions of shares in under 24 hours. Civil rights organizations released statements applauding the move but demanding more. New legislation to tighten financial disclosures for federal judges, a public database tracking judicial travel, and independent oversight of judicial ethics. The fight, they insisted, was not over. It had just changed arenas. In New York, outside the Second Circuit Courthouse, a protester held up a sign that simply read, "The robe doesn't make you just." In Phoenix, a group of high school students studying government placed a photo of Clarence Thomas on a classroom bulletin board, half of it covered in red tape, with the words "recused," too late for some. Even among legal conservatives, whispers began to grow. If Thomas could fall this far from grace, what other decisions were built on compromise ground? The symbolic weight of his recusal was not lost on the immigrant communities he had once ruled against. In Houston, a church that had been raided during Sunday Mass 2 years prior hosted a vigil, not of mourning, but of solemn gratitude. A woman who had once hidden her children in the church basement during a sweep stood at the pulpit, holding up a laminated photo of her husband, who had been deported that same day. "We asked for protection," she said, "and for years the court turned its back. Today it turned its face, if only for a moment." But perhaps the most unforgettable reaction came from within Crockett's own district. At a community gathering organized by local educators and healthcare workers, a young girl, barely 10 years old, stood beside her mother, holding a paper sign scrawled in crayon. "Thank you for making hospitals safe." She didn't understand recusal. She didn't know who Clarence Thomas was, but she knew her mother had stopped crying in the car. She knew her father could go to the clinic again. She knew her teacher had smiled that morning, not from obligation, but from relief. In that moment, it became clear. Thomas's retreat was not Crockett's greatest victory. Her real triumph was the quiet, cumulative dignity restored to people he had never thought to see. And as the sun set over the Capitol that night, Clarence Thomas remained in his chambers, isolated, unspoken, diminished not by political force, but by a woman he once tried to dismiss with a word like emotional. He had tried to silence her. She had stayed standing. And now, with a single sentence, he had stepped away. Not out of grace, but because he no longer had a choice. Clarence Thomas's quiet retreat might have closed one chapter, but the spotlight did not follow him into the shadows. Instead, it turned toward the woman he tried to silence. Because Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a lawmaker. She had become something far rarer, a symbol, not of victory, but of resistance, not of status, but of courage. Jasmine Crockett had stood before a centuries-old system designed to dismiss voices like hers, and she had refused to lower hers. She had been interrupted, belittled, accused of dramatizing the law. She had faced down the weight of tradition and power disguised as procedure. And she had answered not with fury, but with facts, not with spectacle, but with unrelenting clarity. That was what the country had seen, not just a courtroom drama, but a confrontation with something deeper, the machinery of silence that cloaks itself in robes, gavel taps, and institutional immunity. She didn't just fight Clarence Thomas. She fought the idea that empathy was weakness, that compassion was naive, that the law must be bloodless to be real. Her name began to appear in places it never had before. Time magazine placed her on the cover with the headline, "The Woman Who Redrew the Line." The Washington Post ran a full-length profile titled, "From Silence to Symbol, Jasmine Crockett and the Soul of Justice." On college campuses, law students quoted her arguments not because they were part of the syllabus, but because they struck like lightning. Justice does not change with the accent of the accused. Murals appeared overnight in cities across America. In Oakland, a brick wall was painted with her image, flanked by the words, "We are not illegal, we are undeniable." In Brooklyn, a church choir sang a rewritten gospel hymn in her honor. And on the streets of Tucson, a boy on a bicycle wore a backpack that simply read, "Protected, finally." But perhaps what made Jasmine's rise so powerful was not her presence. It was the system's absence. In a nation where institutions so often fail to admit failure, she did not become a hero because the system changed. She became one because she forced it to look at itself and flinch. She stood where few dared stand, against the cold machinery of a court that had, for years, ruled as if the Constitution were a fortress built only for the few. She reminded us, that the law is not sacred unless it protects the people it was written for. And if it forgets those people, then it is not law, it is performance. In speeches that followed, Crockett never claimed the spotlight. She redirected it, to the nurse who testified in tears, to the child left screaming at a school gate, to the man who died in the back of a transport van, still hooked to an IV line. "This isn't about me," she said, standing on the steps of the Capitol under a sky dark with storm clouds. "This is about what happens when you see something cruel in the system and decide you're not going to wait for someone else to fight it. You become the one who does." Her voice trembled only once, when she said the name José Ramón Ruiz. And yet, what lingered wasn't her anger. It was her question, the one that remained long after the hearings ended, long after the ruling was secured, long after Thomas's recusal letter had faded into the archives. A question not of policy, but of purpose. One sentence, offered without theatrics or demand, spoken during her closing remarks when the cameras were still and the gallery hushed to listen. She looked up, voice steady, and asked, "If justice is only the cold letter of the law, then who protects humanity?" No one answered that day. because the answer was never meant to come from the court. It was meant to come from us. And for the first time in a long time, it did. And in the wake of her final words, as the cameras dimmed and the chambers emptied, one truth refused to leave the air. This wasn't just a policy victory or a courtroom reckoning. It was a human lesson the country had been too long afraid to learn. Justice isn't about robes or gavels or Latin phrases carved into stone. It isn't about who can quote precedent faster or who has clerked for whom. Jasmine Crockett taught us that justice, true justice, is built at the fragile, trembling intersection between law and empathy. And it is only there, in that narrow space, that we find the kind of courage that reshapes nations. She didn't walk into that courtroom expecting mercy. She didn't expect fairness. She walked in with the full understanding that the system she was confronting wasn't made for people like her. People who speak plainly, people who come from struggle, people who carry names not written in marble but in grief. And she still walked in anyway, not to win, not to be right, but to demand that the law look her in the eye and answer for who it had forgotten. The human lesson she left behind is not comfortable because it forces us to reckon with what we've allowed justice to become. For too long, we've let legality stand in place of morality. We've accepted cruelty as efficiency, dehumanization as security, and silence as neutrality. But when a child is torn from their father in front of a school gate, when a dying patient is dragged from an operating table because he overstayed a visa, when a preacher pauses mid-sermon as ICE agents walk into a sanctuary with guns on their belts, those are not mistakes of policy. They are the outcome of a system designed to forget humanity in its obsession with order. And Jasmine Crockett, against all odds, reminded us that the system has no soul unless someone fights to put one there. She taught us that compassion is not a loophole in the law, it is its highest function. That the strength of a nation is not measured by how it protects its most powerful, but by how it shelters its most vulnerable. That no law is above question if it enables suffering in silence. And most of all, that no person, no matter how loud, how different, how inconvenient, should ever be told they are too emotional to stand for justice. Because emotion, in the face of injustice, is not a flaw. It is a response born from survival. It is the cry of every family who has ever watched a loved one vanish into a system that never bothered to learn their name. The lesson was not just for judges or lawmakers, it was for all of us. For every citizen who turned away from stories that felt too heavy. For every voter who believed justice only mattered when it knocked on their door. For every neighbor who saw a raid down the block and chose silence. Jasmine's journey demanded that we see again, that we feel again, that we remember the law is not some cold abstraction handed down from Olympus. It is a living contract, and when it fails to protect the living, it fails entirely. What she revealed, through calm fire and relentless truth, is that institutional change begins with moral discomfort. That change is not born in chambers or subcommittees, but in the moment someone dares to say, "This is wrong and I won't let it stand." It's in the moment a woman reads the name of a man ICE let die in custody and refuses to let him disappear into paperwork. It's in the moment she looks into the face of a Supreme Court justice and asks the question no one else has dared to voice. If justice is only the cold letter of the law, then who protects the warm, beating pulse of humanity beneath it? She never got a direct answer, but she never needed one, because the answer was already there, in the echo of her voice across the chamber, in the tears of nurses watching from hospital rooms, in the sudden stillness of legal scholars who had spent careers justifying the unjust, and in the millions of Americans who saw her not as a politician, but as a reminder of who we could be if we chose to care. And so the human lesson remains. Law without heart is just power, and power left unchecked devours the very people it was sworn to defend. Jasmine Crockett's name may one day fade from headlines, but what she stood for cannot. Not if we are to survive as more than just a nation of statutes and borderlines, but as a society that remembers its duty to the people within it. We must remember what she showed us, that justice doesn't begin in the courtroom. It begins in the refusal to accept injustice as normal. It begins every time we choose to listen instead of look away. Every time we recognize that empathy is not weakness, but the foundation of civilization. And if we forget that, we won't just lose policy, we'll lose something far greater. We'll lose the soul of what law was always meant to be, not a tool of control, but a promise that someone, somewhere, will be seen, will be heard, will be protected. That is what Jasmine Crockett left us. And now it's our turn to carry it forward. And if Jasmine Crockett's voice reminded us what justice could sound like, urgent, trembling, righteous, then it falls to us to answer her echo, not with applause, but with action. Because this is not the end of the story. This is the moment between breath and battle, between recognition and responsibility. A law was upheld, a justice recused. A woman who was nearly silenced stood and rewrote the terms of power. But the machine that made her fight in the first place is still running. The fear ICE manufactured in neighborhoods is still real. The doors kicked in at dawn, the parents separated from children in waiting rooms, the pastors interrupted mid-prayer. All of that is still possible in other forms, under other names, with other justifications. And if we treat this as victory and walk away, it will happen again. Only louder, only crueler, only more invisible. So now the question is no longer, what did Jasmine Crockett do? The question is, what will you do? Because change, real change, is not built on court rulings. It is built on pressure. Pressure applied again and again by people who refuse to look away. This moment calls for more than celebration. It demands commitment. It demands discomfort. It demands that you step into the tension Jasmine faced every day and ask yourself, am I willing to stand where she stood? Not with cameras, not with speeches, but when it costs you something. When your family, your job, your name might be put at risk. Because that is what courage looks like in real life. Not convenient, but costly. Not clean, but necessary. If you're a citizen, don't just vote, organize. Don't wait for the next election cycle to pay attention. Call your representatives. Demand permanent legal protections for sensitive locations. Demand oversight of ICE. Demand mandatory recusal for justices with financial ties to lobbying groups. Demand independent enforcement of judicial ethics, not self-policing. If you're in a union, pass resolutions. If you're in a classroom, teach the truth. If you're in a newsroom, keep the light shining where power prefers darkness. If you're in a pulpit, speak their names. If you're undocumented and afraid, know this: you are not alone anymore. And to every hospital worker, school administrator, social worker, and faith leader, this is your front line. Refuse cooperation when the state demands complicity. Use your status as sanctuary. Print the law. Post it on the door. Make it impossible for the next agent, the next raid, the next injustice to hide behind ignorance. Be loud. Be legal. Be unshakable. Jasmine didn't push that bill through just for headlines. She did it because she knew these places weren't political. They were human, and now they're protected. Use that protection. Stretch it. Defend it like the lives inside your walls depend on it. Because they do. And when they come again, and they will, because power always retools, be ready. Not with violence, but with vigilance. With community networks. With pro bono legal clinics. With civil disobedience if it comes to that. Because what Jasmine showed us wasn't that the system can be trusted, it was that the system can be confronted. And it is only confronted when we are louder than its lies. Let this be the last time a Supreme Court justice must be forced into recusal by public outrage. Let this be the beginning of a generation that no longer accepts legal as a synonym for right. Let this be the fire that wakes up every person who has ever sat in silence while someone else's humanity was debated like policy. Because if the law cannot feel, then we must be its nerve endings. If the law cannot see, we must be its eyes. If the law cannot move, we must carry it forward. That is not the burden of politicians. That is the duty of citizens. This moment belongs to you now. Take it. Use it. Build from it. And don't stop. Not now. Not ever. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.